How is it that two people can go through the exact same trauma, yet need completely different psychological treatments? Hello and welcome to this explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're going to investigate that exact mystery. We are setting the stage for a really deep dive into the nuanced, forensic toolkit of psychological assessment. We're going to unpack exactly how clinicians peer into the black box of the human mind, using this fascinating array of tools that range from hard, objective science all the way to deeply empathetic, qualitative observation. Let's get right into it.
Okay, so let's confront the ultimate challenge that clinicians face every single day. How do you take broad medical science, which, relies heavily on the bell curve, group averages, and hard statistics, and apply it to the staggering, messy, totally unpredictable reality of a completely unique individual? I mean, every mind you encounter is shaped by completely different histories, traumas, environments, and biology. Balancing that cold, scientific rigor with the warmth of human complexity, well, that's what the mechanics of assessment are truly all about.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the N of 1 problem. Second, the mental status exam. Third, mapping the family system. Fourth, clinician bias and custom questions. And finally, number 5, the ultimate assessment balance.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the N of 1 problem, understanding the individual.
To really grasp this concept, we've got to look at the term idiographic. The word actually comes from the Greek root idios, which means personal or distinct. It is literally the absolute foundation of individualized assessment. When clinicians face what's called the N of 1 problem, which is the massive challenge of taking clinical constructs based on huge populations and applying them to a sample size of exactly one person, they need an idiographic understanding. They have to figure out how a person's highly specific environmental conditions and their singular personality combine to actually produce their behavior.
And case studies are exactly how we build that understanding. But a case study isn't just a casual chat. It's a rigorous, forensic synthesis of medical records, school reports, interviews, and real-time observations. It forces the clinician to move way beyond those disembodied quantitative test scores and really look at the whole person in context. Whether it's piecing together how a world leader's unique personality interacted with historical events, or uncovering why a super bright student is suddenly struggling academically, a comprehensive case study uncovers the why behind the what. It gives you that rich human context that raw data just completely misses.
So why does this chronological deep dive matter so much in a clinical setting? Well, looking at the timeline allows clinicians to perform a differential diagnosis, which basically means pinpointing the exact root of a symptom. And this is where it gets incredibly fascinating. Imagine an elderly patient experiencing severe memory loss. Are they suffering from an incurable organic deficit like dementia? Or is it a functional deficit like pseudodementia, which is actually caused by severe but highly treatable depression? By looking at the precipitating events and the exact timeline in a case study, a clinician might realize they aren't looking at neurological decline at all. They're looking at a mood disorder. That realization completely changes the treatment plan, and ultimately, it changes the patient's life.
Moving right along to Section 2, the mental status exam, the psychological, physical.
Originally formulated by Adolf Meyer way back in 1902, the mental status examination is basically the psychological equivalent of a routine medical physical. But how exactly does it work? Well, a clinician goes through a checklist. They check your orientation, which is documented as oriented times 3, meaning you know who you are, where you are, and what time it is. They carefully gauge your affect and mood. And there's a really brilliant clinical distinction here. Mood is the overall emotional climate, kind of like a long, cold winter, while affect is the daily weather, like a sudden sunny day right in the middle of that winter. They'll also analyze your thought content for things like hallucinations, they'll test your memory and consciousness, and they'll evaluate your insight to see if you actually recognize that you need help. It's an incredibly robust screening for both intellectual and neurological deficits.
Yet, there's a deep irony here. Despite being modeled after a strict medical physical, this rigorous exam still relies almost entirely on the clinician's subjective gut feeling. There are no hard objective norms to point to. The clinician is using their own personal expertise and judgment to decide what counts as an inappropriate affect or an illogical thought. So inherently, it introduces this massive layer of human subjectivity into what looks, on paper, like a purely objective test.
And this creates a really tricky trade-off when clinics try to streamline the process. To save time, they often use narrower versions like the Mini Mental State Examination, or MMSE. Now, the MMSE is fantastic and lightning fast for highlighting cognitive impairment, but it comes at a cost.
A patient might perfectly ace the MMSE by successfully drawing overlapping shapes and remembering a list of words, while simultaneously experiencing severe, quiet paranoia that the test simply isn't designed to catch. Basically, you gain clinical speed, but you lose your diagnostic peripheral vision.
All right, zooming out a bit, let's head into Section 3, Mapping the Family System, Community Geneograms. Think of a genogram as a therapist's version of a family tree. It completely shifts our focus from the internal workings of a single brain out to the broader social and familial environment. But trust me, it goes so much deeper than just listing who married whom and when.
Genograms typically map out a minimum of 3 to 4 generations. Now, why so many? Well, because psychological patterns, things like substance abuse, specific trauma responses, or deeply ingrained relational dynamics, they often skip generations or they mutate slowly over decades. By charting 3 or 4 generations, these invisible long-term tectonic plates of a family's psychological architecture are suddenly made completely visible, both to the clinician and to the client. This massive, multi-generational view is the absolute backbone of a biopsychosocial assessment. And it's vital because family factors can profoundly accelerate or completely stall treatment. Let's take symptom accommodation, for example. Imagine a family constantly buying excessive amounts of hand soap and entirely changing their own daily routines to accommodate a child's untreated OCD. They are inadvertently keeping the disorder alive just to keep the peace at home. A genogram helps a clinician spot that exact dynamic, or highlight deep financial stressors. You simply cannot treat a patient effectively without understanding the specific ecosystem they return to every single night. That brings us to Section 4, Clinician Bias and Custom Questions, the Narrative of Suffering. Custom, unstructured questions are a fascinating double-edged sword. On one hand, they offer a rich, idiographic focus. They capture the highly unique personal experiences and tiny nuances that a rigid, standardized test just glosses right over. They give the client the space to actually tell their own story. But on the other hand, because they lack explicit inference rules and standardized scoring, the exact same answer could be interpreted as wildly creative by one clinician and dangerously manic by another. They are incredibly vulnerable to subjectivity. That lack of standardized rules leaves the assessment wide open to cognitive bias. Take the halo effect, for instance. Clinically, this might look like a therapist subconsciously assuming that a highly articulate, immaculately dressed patient couldn't possibly be suffering from severe, debilitating depression. The clinician lets one positive trait completely overshadow severe pathology. Or consider confirmatory bias, where the interviewer only asks questions that validate their split-second initial impression of the client. Without objective normative data to act as a guardrail, a clinician might just see what they want to see, making it pretty much impossible to scientifically compare results across cases. Which brings us to our grand finale, Section 5. The ultimate assessment balance, science meets human complexity.
First, we have to define the nomothetic frame of reference, which is the polar opposite of the individualized idiographic approach we've been talking about. Think back to that bell curve. A nomothetic approach uses perfectly uniform procedures and scoring to find exactly where one human mind sits in the vast ocean of millions of others. It provides the crucial mathematical anchor that tells a clinician what average or abnormal actually means in a strict statistical sense.
So here is the ultimate clinical paradox of our entire explainer today. On one side, we have standardized tests. They're objective, uniform, and mathematically perfect for timely evaluations, but they are entirely blind to human nuance. On the other side, we have non-standardized methods. They're flexible, rich, and they see the deep human truth, but they're scientifically chaotic and highly vulnerable to bias. To truly map the human mind, exceptional clinical psychology has to be an art just as much as it is a science. A genuinely comprehensive assessment demands marrying both of these approaches. You desperately need the standardized tests and cold, hard statistics to anchor you against peer norms, but you equally need the messy, non-standardized methods to build rapport, generate hypotheses, and deploy the deep human empathy required to actually heal the person sitting right in front of you. Which brings us to the final thought of our journey together today. If a highly objective, standardized test completely ignores your unique life story and trauma, but a deeply personal, flexible interview leaves you totally vulnerable to a clinician's subconscious biases, which one would you trust to diagnose you? It's a profound question about how we quantify humanity, and one I hope leaves you thinking long after this explainer ends. Thank you so much for exploring the mechanics of psychological assessment with me.